So, with more awareness comes more responsibility. And we've heard, the more that you've been given, the more that you're responsible for. And I like to add, the more that you're asking of yourself, the more that you also need to give yourself. So, just to go through some points that may be really obvious to some and less to others if you just haven't thought about it as much. With more awareness, like your standards increase, your standards for yourself increase. So it's more easy to like catch yourself in the act before doing a thing that before you would have been unconscious of, but now you are. So you can catch yourself a lot quicker. So your standards go up because now you want to choose differently, you want to act differently. And you're also aware or more aware of like how any given action or choice also has other kinds of consequences. Like almost no choice only affects the person involved, like one person, right? The butterfly effect. Everything is connected, everything is always already in relation. So this is what I find so fascinating and fundamental about our intersubjective sphere. I mean, there's many of these spheres. So most anything that we talk about in social terms is intersubjective, and including a lot of things that actually we don't even talk about in those terms. They just get like overlooked, or it's just not commonly discussed as being like an intersubjective reality when it is. So like one example here would be our energy fields. So we have an energy field within and around our body, and this is always already in relation to everyone else's, to the energy field of like the tree that I'm sitting under. And in that sense, we're also all connected on that level as well. And there are other similar or analogous kinds of intersubjective connections. Any use of language is also an intersubjective gesture. So it's like having a common table and everyone is invited to it, and you can share your accounts, you can share your ideas, you can share the history of how you reached certain conclusions, you can express your emotions, and you can put this all on this common collective table. Who Anyone is invited who has access through the language. And the point of doing there can be several points of doing this, but like one important aspect is that the act of laying it all out there naturally invites a kind of whataboutism, in the sense that any position is a posit, like like a deposit, right? You deposit something into the bank, you're making a posit, and it naturally invites the logical supposition of a kind of like, what would negate that? What would be another context or another like counterfactual that you could add to this to challenge it or fortify it, right? And so that's also an inherent gift of language, because it allows us to do that like in a really really controlled and kind of precise and aware way. So someone sharing a position, someone sharing the argument that they reached, naturally invites the possibility of, well, wait a minute, what about, this and this? And the person bringing in a what about isn't, that's not even necessarily right either, right? It's about leaving it on the table for examination, because in turn, they may have left out an important context or fact or truth. It's just fascinating because language is such a rich, intersubjective, collective inheritance. And this is why it's important to preserve as many languages as we can. The speakers of the language want to preserve it. And like it raises a lot of interesting questions too, because of the way in which it is so intersubjective, right? It's not subjective. Like it's not, I'm going to talk about wow, I went and I bought a new table for my kitchen, and then someone's not going to come in and say like, look at that, that's not a table, this is like, I'm going to call this a something something. And So there's like a spectrum of what it even makes sense to like try and negate. And this is getting into super complex territory because it relates to our embodied lived experience, which is partly subjective, but we have objective relations with the world too. So it's just really rich territory for exploring these relations between subjective, objective, and intersubjective. Someone has recently made the really good point, for example, that um, there's different understandings of language too, and there's a particularly he used the word narcissist relationship with language, which is that within a narcissist dynamic, let's do this. Language is not seen as an intersubjective entity in this way. Language is seen more as like a tool, like a concrete thing that maybe like you push around or you pull around or you use it to like get what you want, or um like it's brought into this like really dense kind of level of like transactions or something, rather than a medium for the exchange of consciousness and the cultivation of meaning and a window into someone's subjective experience, which within a narcissist dynamic, that's not even really recognized, right? Like somebody else's subjective experience is super triggering within that dynamic. So this is really, I'm kind of like wandering around my point here, but I think I'm trying to bring this back to the idea of language being a sacred technology as one of our very first human technologies, intersubjective technologies. And this also relates to, like, luckily, I recently just saw a really good reel where this guy was talking about the magical function of language and how in ancient times magic was primarily accessed through linguistic means. And so he was like tracing out the etymological links between our ideas of spelling and the magic spell. Also, we have specific uses, of course, like curses and blessings and prayers, obviously. And he was also linking like the history of grammar with the grimoire, and of course, like the Latin cantare with incantation. And it was like a really beautiful account. And so, I mean, it's another way of looking at language as sacred technology. And also recently, there's been more attention to the way in which language itself can serve as a cage, of course, in many accounts, awareness around the limiting functions of language, because it does bring into existence a certain angle on reality. It acts as a filter in the same way that our brain acts as a filter on consciousness. Language can act as a filter, and yet that's precisely why we engage in it, because it's a living document. It's like living inheritance. And so that's why dialogue and co-calibration are still needed. There's words from like 300 years ago that no longer have their same meaning. So language is a living thing. So this is just some fun food for thought, I guess. I'm trying to feel my way around this argument where there are less noble uses of language, basically, and very much like higher and more noble uses of language. Absolutely. And as with many things, I guess, it just comes down to our own embodiment, our own presence. Like, are we bringing ourselves into this? Are we bringing our consciousness here to meet with another consciousness, to exchange consciousness and meaning? Or are we checking out? Are we just like automating something, removing consciousness, literally? So, for example, someone was recently talking about like a lot of the guys on the dating apps doing this, like just like letting their automation respond instead of like being there themselves. And well, what's the point of that, right? You think you're saving yourself some time or something. That's just, to me, that's like next level gross. And if my views seem like really like outlandish or something, it's very soon it won't be. Like, for example, you guys know Adam Grant. Like, he was recently also just talking about the thinking function of language too. And it's not just about like having some like results that you can get on a page and then you can share with somebody else so that you can retrieve or extract a specific result for yourself. Writing is actually a medium of thought as well. So your thinking needs to be a part of it if you're going to develop your thinking, because this is another topic, but like thinking itself is something like a lot more complex even than language can access. So language has really been our best medium for developing thought. And so if you're not really part of that process anymore, you also lose that function of language. So this is not just me or a weird opinion, but it's pretty foundational if you study anthropology, if you study certain branches of psychology. So, and I want to just raise something that kind of might seem to some as kind of like a counterpoint to this. But for example, in a recent podcast on the Diary of a CEO, Stephen interviewed a very well respected mathematician. And I thought he said this wasn't the main topic of what they were discussing something else, but out of hand, he started to use this language where he said something like, he was talking to Steven about the way he answered something, and he said, he kind of like called him out, and he kind of said something like, well, now you're just sounding like an LLM. You're just, you're not doing any real thinking. You're just, this is your LLM. And he was using that in a metaphorical sense, and I got his point, but it raises the question of when someone is kind of acting like their own LLM, which would mean, again, consciousness is not present, like true thought is not present. You're kind of like relying on your own conditioned responses. um Language itself is obviously not an LLM. As I just said, language is a living entity. It's like a living inheritance. It's always changing. Why is it always changing? Because of human consciousness and human interaction. And when you're authentically rooted and you are present, you're embodied in your own presence and consciousness, you're not speaking through your own LLM. If you're directly relating to the present moment, you're not speaking through your own LLM. Again, using this in a super metaphorical sense, one example where you might be using an LLM, for example, is like you go home to visit certain family members and there's a certain kind of like scripted development to like the way certain interactions might play out. And then, I think that's a great example of when you could say like, oh yeah, you're using like one of your own LLMs. Indeed, the whole family unit may have a certain kind of like LLM that they draw upon, like certain scripts, certain sentences, certain kinds of expressions are allowed and others are not allowed. So in that sense, I think it's kind of an interesting metaphor. But if you are following, for example, if you resonate with the work of like Krishnamurti, and you are cultivating a direct relationship with truth, with your own truth, with relations with others, you are not going to be working through your own LLM. Like your language will be rooted, it will be authentic, it will be present, it will reflect presence, it will reflect the nuances of the moment as it's actually unfolding intersubjectively. So I think you guys see what I'm trying to say here. I'm kind of like working around this whole circle to try to get at this point. It's going to be like an ongoing conversation. A lot of people will be talking about this who maybe they haven't studied it. I studied this. This is literally like a huge chunk of like what I studied in undergrad, graduate school. But a lot of people who haven't and haven't had any of this background, now it's like becoming like a popular, literally, area just because of what's going on with AI. So I thought it might be useful for some to like try to put some of this out there. Let me know what you think. And just as a final thought here, that may actually be like one defining feature of what's really ultimately going to separate an LLM from human experience and human expression is the fact that to develop, we do need to work through our vulnerability. We have a fundamental vulnerability that any kind of like encoded programmatic system is never going to have. And we have this really direct relationship with our own finitude, which is our coming death. We're always in the process of dying. And the more aware we become, the more we are in relationship with that. And so the more we're in relationship with our own temporality and the experience of the present moment, the depth of that experience in relation to our knowledge of our own impending death. So, sorry, this is a little deep or sobering, but it is what it is. And so that's the kind of vulnerability that you aren't going to truly have with an LLM. If you did, it would have to be encoded. It would be just another part of the program. So kind of annulling itself. But let me know what you guys think. If this is stuff that you're already starting to think about, if you just think, who cares? Let me know why. But hopefully some of this was insightful. Thanks for listening and watching, and let me know what you think and drop a comment and I'll keep talking.